Hey guys, this is Rachel with CypressTextiles and welcome to the Learn to Crochet Learning Portal Level 3. Today I wanted to show you a stitch called a cluster stitch, and this is the first of 4 stitches that we're going to be learning for this level. So this Shavius Callista is going to show us how to make a cluster stitch. So this is a double crochet. I'm going to start by making a cluster in the next stitch. So I'll show you what it means to make a cluster. You can make a DC cluster, a TR cluster. There's tons of different cluster stitches you can make, but I'm going to show you a very simple cluster, which is a 3 DC cluster. So this is a very common stitch, 3 DC cluster. So I'm going to just make a chain here, a couple of chains, because usually whenever you have a cluster, there are chain stitches on either side of it, just because a cluster kind of needs some space, and you'll see what I mean. So you're going to be working stitches all into the same chain or stitch or chain space, but the point is you're making all your stitches into the same stitch. And you might be thinking, like, how is that not an increase? Because when we talked about increasing, we talked about making several stitches in the same stitch. So what a cluster stitch is it's kind of a cross between an increase and a decrease. So you're going to be making a bunch of stitches into one stitch, but you're going to be decreasing them all together at the same time. So essentially, you're going to increase and then decrease back down in the same stitch. And that's what's going to form kind of a coin shape or an oval shape or an egg shape. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to yarn over. Remember, this is a 3 DC cluster. So I'm going to yarn over, go into the next chain, pull up a loop, and draw the yarn through 2 loops on the hook. So that is like one leg of my cluster. Since it's a cluster, all of these are going to go into the same stitch. So you can remember that this was kind of like how our decrease looked, but instead of going into the next stitch, I'm going to go into the same stitch. So I'm going to yarn over, go into the same stitch, pull up a loop, draw the yarn through 2 loops on the hook again. All right, and since this is a 3 DC cluster, I'm going to do that one more time. Yarn over, insert the hook in the same stitch, pull up a loop, draw the yarn through 2 loops on the hook. So I've got 3 partial DCs, just like I did when I was making decreases, but I have them all in the same stitch, just like I did when I was making increases. So now I'm going to yarn over and draw the yarn through all 4 loops. And that is how I make a 3 DC cluster. So that's what a cluster stitch looks like. It's kind of like an oval, it's kind of like a flower petal, whatever you think of it as. But it's very useful and it's in a lot of crochet patterns. So I would like make a chain or something or 2 and then go and skip some stitches here because they need space. If you butt them up right against a double crochet, it's almost like you can't even tell what's going on. So usually in a pattern, these are isolated because they're just supposed to be decorative, like a flower petal or something, or a leaf or something. So that is our DC3 together. So if I was gonna do, that is our 3 DC cluster. So if I was going to make a 4 DC cluster, all I would have to do is just go into the stitch with my partial DCs 4 times instead of 3 to make a 4 DC cluster. All right, so if you know how to increase and decrease, then you know how to make a cluster. A cluster is basically a decrease, but all in the same stitch. All right, you're not traveling. If you traveled, then you would be making a decrease. So to make that more clear, you're starting with 1 stitch and you're still ending with 1. So you haven't increased or decreased anything with this cluster stitch, even though it looks like you're making a ton of stitches in there. So here is a 4 DC cluster. It's a little wider. So it's like a circle. It's more like a circle than an oval. So whatever is, your stylistic fancy is how many, legs you can have in your cluster stitch. You could make like a 5DC cluster, I guess. And then you can also do other stitches like let's say a 4TR cluster. So you yarn over twice, and it's just like making your treble decrease. You just leave your last loop on your hook, go into the same stitch instead of the next stitch, and that's what makes it a cluster instead of a decrease. All right, so I'm going to make a 4TR cluster. So I'm doing 4 partial trebles in the same stitch. Now I've got 5 loops on my hook, my leading loop, and my 4 partial trebles in the same stitch. Now I'll yarn over and draw the yarn through all 4 of those stitches, and that is my 4TR cluster. I really like this stitch because it looks so much like a flower petal, and I use it a lot. So that is a cluster stitch, you guys. I think that's all I want to say about a cluster. You can tell what your cluster stitch is going to look like because it's going to have a number and then a stitch. So it could be a 2DC cluster. So you're going to make 2 partial DCs in the same stitch and then draw the yarn through all of them. Or it could be a 3 treble cluster. So you're going to make 3 partial trebles all in the same stitch, and that's going to make your cluster. So that's kind of how you know what type of stitch you're going to make when you're making your cluster, by the number and then by the stitch name. So I think that's everything I want to talk about with a cluster stitch. And in our next video, we're going to learn how to make a bobble and the difference between a cluster and a bobble and all that good stuff. So I will see you guys on that next video. Happy crafting, y'all.